I want to talk about the theory of the Trinity that Anselm develops in his more mature work on this question, namely on the incarnation of the Word. There, Anselm has a very different view from the view that he develops when he's analyzing the same problem in the Monologion. There, you might think, he really ends up being in the position of identifying Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It wasn't just Anselm, however, who had a tendency to do that. In fact, there was a very powerful tendency by that point in the medieval church that was dedicated to nominalism. The origin of that came from a monk, Roscelin, who advanced the view that there was nothing remotely like a Platonic form. There were no universals. Everything that exists is a particular object. There are powerful reasons to have such a view. After all, if there are these universals, things that are multiply instantiated, but not really themselves present in space or time, and thereby it seems as if we stand in no causal relation to them, how can we know about them? How could we even refer to them? How can we use abstract terms that actually refer to them if we have no kind of contact with them at all? There are reasons for embracing a nominalist attitude, but it leads to some disturbing consequences when you apply it to the Trinity, because then you end up saying that the distinction between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is purely a verbal distinction. These so-called universals are really nothing but, well, empty noises, as Roscelin put it. And so it would look as if Father, Son, Holy Spirit are just three words for precisely the same thing, namely God. Well, that's not the only disturbing consequence that might be thought to follow from nominalism, but it's the one that motivates Anselm when he writes on the incarnation of the Word. Anselm himself is a Platonist, so he utterly rejects that nominalism for various metaphysical reasons, but he's also disturbed about the implications it has for the Trinity. And in the context of developing his own view, he actually develops something that's quite innovative. He gives us an extraordinarily powerful model of the Trinity, as well as a general philosophical view that goes along with it. So let's talk about the problem that he sees at the very outset. He says, while I was still abbot in the monastery of Bec, a certain cleric in France, namely Roscelin, presumed to say this: if, he said, the three persons are only one thing and not three things, each intrinsically separate like three angels or three souls, such that they are none the less identical in will and power, then the Father and the Holy Spirit as well as the Son became flesh. When this was reported to me, I began to compose a letter against this error, a letter that I held to be of little value after I composed part of it, believing there to be no need of it. I thought there to be no need, both because the one against whom I was writing had abjured his error in the council, and because there seemed to be no one who would not know that the individual in question erred. But some brothers without my knowledge transcribed the part I had written and handed it over to others to read. So he figured he'd better set the matter straight, and that's precisely what he does here. Now, I think what he does is actually rather intriguing, because he suggests that there is something that we need to do, philosophically speaking, before we can really understand the nature of the Trinity. So before we go any further in Anselm, let me talk about that particular view. The locus classicus for a view that is known now as a relative identity theory is John Locke. In the essay concerning human understanding, Locke is discussing the question of personal identity. What makes me me? What makes baby me, and then young me, adolescent me, young adult me, and me now, all the same human being? Locke says that the criteria for being the same thing depends on the kind of thing we're talking about. It's one thing to be the same lump of matter. It's another thing to be the same machine, yet another to be the same animal, and finally, a different thing yet to be the same person. And so what it is for me to be the same human being is not exactly the same as what it is to be the same person. Person, he says, is a forensic term. It has normative implications because people have rights, people have responsibilities. On the other hand, the criterion for being the same human being is simply being the same animal. Now, the difference for him is this. For me to be the same human being over time is for me to establish a certain kind of bodily continuity over time. And so various parts of my body might be lost or might be interchanged, but nevertheless it's still me as long as there's sufficient continuity. I can become a bionic Dan Bonavac and still be Dan Bonavac if the transformation is gradual enough that there is that continuity. On the other hand, he says, it's a matter of continuity of consciousness that makes me the same person. So could we have, he asks, two different human beings with one person, one consciousness? Well, yes, if, let's say, I managed to be reincarnated and there was enough mental continuity between me and my reincarnation that we counted as the same person. You could also have two people in the same human being through, for example, something like a split personality. There could be two different continuous consciousnesses that are really discontinuous from one another, inhabiting the same body. Now, however you feel about those questions, we can apply the same idea of relative identity to other things. Think about Alan Gibber's example of the statue of Goliath made out of a lump of clay that we could call Lumpel. We have the lump of clay, we mold it into the statue of Goliath, and then suppose something bad happens and it gets smushed back into the lump. Has it been the same throughout? Well, the same lump of clay, yes. The same lump of clay was a lump, then a statue, and then a lump again. On the other hand, was it the same statue? Well, no. Here it wasn't a statue at all. Then it got formed into Goliath. Then it got smashed and was no longer a statue at all. And so, same lump of clay? Yes. Same statue throughout? No. And that is something that we have to take into account. The idea is this, then, being the same, being identical, according to Locke, depends on a certain sortal term, a certain term that specifies the criterion for establishing identity. So we can't simply say, is this the same as that? We have to say, is this the same lump of matter as that? Is this the same machine or the same animal or the same person as that? The same lump of clay or the same statue? It matters what we say. And there is no way to simply understand absolute identity claims like, is this the same as that? We have to say, is this the same what as that? Relativity is the relativity of identity to a what, to some kind of term or concept that allows us to specify a criterion of identity. Peter Geach is the most prominent contemporary defender of this view. He says at the very beginning of his article on relative identity, I am arguing for the thesis that identity is relative. And he goes on to talk about a variety of examples that illustrate the point. We really don't know how to understand sameness apart from some criterion of identity. And we need a term that is going to specify that criterion. So same lump of matter, same machine, same human being, same person, all of those are different criteria. Same thing with same lump of matter as opposed to same statue. Sometimes the relativity isn't very clearly marked by language. So if we think about the classic ship of Theseus problem, for example, we could think about a ship that Theseus is sailing around. Gradually, planks get replaced. As they need replacement, they start to rot or they get damaged in some way. And eventually, every plank on the original ship has been replaced with something else. So is it the same ship or a different ship now? Well, intuitively speaking, we want to say it's the same ship. It's just been gradually repaired. There's a great deal of bodily continuity, structural continuity, even though some things about the structure might have changed and the entire material of the ship might have been changed. Still, in a sense, the same ship. But now, if somebody has gathered up all of the original planks and they have the original plan, they rebuild that ship. It looks like, hey, that's the same original material of the ship of Theseus in the same form. Does that count as the same ship as the one that Theseus started sailing around? Well, it does have the same matter and it does have the same structure. On the other hand, there wasn't the same kind of bodily continuity. There wasn't the same kind of structural continuity that there was in the continuing ship. Maybe the term ship settles the question. In fact, Locke and Hobbes and Hume think it does. But we might actually think it's not so clear. Maybe really we have to think, when we think about ships, for example, we tend to think of them as defined by matter, but is also defined by structure, and finally, as defined in terms of a certain kind of continuity or a function. And we might end up saying that actually here is a case where those criteria clash. So maybe we've got some criteria of identity that normally go along together, just as person and human being usually go together. And the ship of Theseus example, like a reincarnation example or a multiple personalities example, is one that tends to take our criteria and separate them in a way that makes us feel uncomfortable about exactly what to say. Well, what does all this have to do with the problem of the Trinity? It's the key to Anselm's answer. He says we have the same God, but different persons. So Father, Son, Holy Spirit are the same God, the same divine being, but they are different persons. Now, what exactly is a person? Anselm says, I can't really explain that. We don't have a word for that, so we have to introduce a word for that, like, well, person, in order to give us some way of talking about it. But the fact is that language doesn't come with a term that gives us the natural criterion of identity there. And in fact, it's rather hard to specify what the criterion of identity is or how the persons of God relate to God. But we can say that there is a different criterion for individuation in this case, and that enables us to say there is one God and three persons. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are the same God, but they are different persons. This isn't exactly the way Anselm puts the point, but I think it's an equivalent point. So here's how he expresses it. He says, Roscelin would say this: if two persons, the Father and the Son, are not two things, but instead one, then the Father, as well as the Holy Spirit, became flesh with the Son. But Anselm, of course, disagrees, and he says, let's first inquire into what the expression two things means here. For we believe that each of the two persons is what is common to both and what is proper to each. For example, the Father's person is both God, which he shares with the Son, and Father, which is proper to him. Likewise, the Son's person is both God, which he shares with the Father, and Son, which we predicate only of this person. Therefore, these two persons have one thing in common, namely God. So he's saying they are two persons, but one God. And two things is proper, Father and Son, for we understand everything common to them only in regard to what is common. No Christian professes that the Father and the Son, as to their proper things, are one thing. Rather, Christians profess that the Father and the Son, as to their proper things, are two things. We're accustomed to apply the term thing to whatever we in any way assert to be something. The Father is not the Son is not the Father. Now, this seems to suggest they are two things. And he says, well, in a sense, that's right. They are two things, if we mean they are two persons. We're looking at Father and Son. Are they the same? Same person? Well, no. Each has their own proper role. They are to be distinguished with respect to personhood. On the other hand, what about divinity? What about being God? That they share. For the Father and the Son are not two things in such a way that we, in the case of two things, understand their substance when we're talking, for example, about people. But we understand their relations. What we want to say is that God is one, and only one, and an individual and a simple substance, and three persons. So Father and Son are not the same person, but they are the same individual. They are the same simple substance. So we can say there is one substance, one individual, but three persons. There are different criteria of identity operating. Now, at first glance, you might think, I'm not sure I understand. After all, I don't really get how person is individuated. I don't really get how this individual or substance, God, is individuated. So I don't have the same grasp of this that I have after reading Locke on same human being as opposed to same person. What exactly is going on here? And it doesn't help much that Anselm says, well, I can't really explain. We don't really have language for this. However, he does give us a model. And that model, although it's really a development of a model that we've already talked about in Tertullian as well as in Athanasius, is something that he develops to a very high degree. So I think it's well worth thinking about all on its own terms. His example concerns the Nile. Here it is in section 13 of On the Incarnation of the Word. Let us suppose a source from which a river originates and flows. Let us suppose that the river later empties into a delta. Let the river's name be the Nile. So we give the separate names source, river, delta, in such a way that we do not call the source the river or the delta, or the river either the source or the delta the source or the river. But we call the source the Nile, the river the Nile, and the delta the Nile, and both the source and the river together the Nile, both the source and the delta together the Nile, both the river and the delta together the Nile, and all three, the source and the river and the delta, together the Nile. We do so because there is still one and the same Nile, not one and another Nile, whether we call each one singly or pairs of them or all three the Nile. Therefore the source, the river, the delta are three, and the Nile, the running water, the substance, the body of water, one. And we can't call anything three, for neither are there three Niles, or three running waters, or three bodies of water, or three substances, nor are there three sources, or three rivers, or three deltas. Therefore we here predicate one thing of three things, and three things of one thing, and yet not the three things of one another. So that's the idea. What we have here is the source being the Nile, the river being the Nile, the delta being the Nile. There is one Nile, and yet the source is not the river is not the source is not the delta. In fact, we can describe the source and the delta as the Nile, the source and the river as the Nile, the river and the delta as the Nile, or all three as the Nile. And if we think about that, we can think, well, wait a minute, I don't understand. What on earth is going on here? He says, well, really, there is, in the end, one substance here, one body of water, one river in the usual sense, the Nile. But still, there are three, and now here's why it's a great example for him. There are three somethings, okay? We don't have a term for that. We might call it water chunks. The source is really, if we have in mind the White Nile, Lake Victoria. And then we have the main part of the Nile River, and then we have the delta, and it's all the Nile. But we don't really have a term for that middle part, as opposed to the delta part or Lake Victoria itself. Of course, there is a complication here. There are various tributaries like the Blue Nile, which starts at Lake Tana. And if you look at a map of this in Anselm's time, roughly, you see that actually there is a correct identification of three lakes as the source, though the proportions are all wrong. But the idea is this, really. We don't have a term for what there are three of here. There are separable sections, you might say, of the Nile, the delta, the main river part, and the source. But we don't have a term for what those really are. Three whats exactly? We could make up a term like three water chunks or water segments or something like that, but we don't really have it in language itself. He's saying it's exactly the same with God. There is one divine being here, one substance, one God. Nevertheless, there are three. Now, what's exactly? We don't have a term for that. So we simply introduce a term. Just as for the Nile, you might introduce something like water chunk, water segment, or what have you, for the source, the main part of the river, and then the delta. So in the case of God, we introduce a term like person to say what there are three of. But just as it's pretty hard in the case of the river to actually explain what the criteria of identity are that underlie our usage here, so similarly it's rather difficult to explain exactly what the criterion of identity is that underlies our use of the term person. Still, the Nile River is an excellent sort of analog for God because it is something that shares the same three-in-one aspect as the divine being. So Anselm is giving us both a theory of the Trinity, that there is one God in three persons, two different criteria of identity, but also a model that is a very powerful model. Tertullian had talked about a spring and a river and a stream. Athanasius had talked about a well and a stream proceeding from it. So we have the same type of analogy here, but it's richer, more developed, and something that I think comes much closer to approximating the three-in-one idea of the Trinity.